You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Erik Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Erik. All right, Erik, it is great to be back here. This week we are talking about team, and we're a team. We're a podcast team, right?
Yeah,
we're working together, coming up with ideas, and we haven't had any conflict yet. We've made
Praise
some
the
group
Lord.
decisions, and we've got some
Accountability.
goals with this podcast. Yeah. Well, the reason we're talking about that is we're going to look at an article that lists 5 different essential elements to a healthy, functional team. And that's kind of going to be our theme today as we wrap up our discussion on working together with other missionaries. And that's kind of what we're covering directly. It's exciting not only to see what the Lord is doing, but to collaborate with others in the work of the Lord and to see God work through a team, whether it's just a visiting pastor, a visiting national coming through, or whether it's a permanent team that you're working with, or as we mentioned last week, a temporary team that you're working with. There can be great, tremendous benefits to that. We're going to talk a little bit about that, of kind of how do you make sure that you're cultivating a healthy team, especially as missionaries. We're going to be looking at that today, some biblical principles. We're going to be looking at some of human nature. That's what I love about scriptures, right? Scriptures reveal what we're like, it reveals the human nature, and then it gives us some answers and some principles to apply so that we can work together in unity. So we're going to go over that. Well, let's get into it. This is an article that really lays out 5 essential elements. There's a gentleman named Patrick Lencioni. I hope I'm getting that right. And he had written an article years back where basically he came to the conclusion that teams will be dysfunctional unless they have these 5 essential elements. Now, the gentleman who wrote this article, he identifies himself as an organizational scientist and a former church planting missionary to France. His name is David Dunates. I don't know if I'm getting that right or not. But he basically takes these theories that this gentleman, Patrick, had written out, and he puts them to the test, kind of does some scientific experiments, I guess, to find out whether or not these principles do work in real life situations, and then how they can be best implemented and developed so that you can cultivate a healthy, thriving team, specifically when it comes to the mission field. Now, these principles are going to apply to any organizational structure where there's team involved, whether it's your staff at your local church, if you're a pastor in the States, or whether you're working a job, you're a business owner, a businessman, whatever the case may be, if you're working in this team concept, these will have great benefit. And so we're just going to do some discussion and look at how they will apply to us. So the first one is trust. Okay, you have to develop and cultivate trust. We're going to look at what that means. Is trust important in relationships, Erik?
Oh, yes, I would
How
say.
would you define trust?
Trust. Well, I guess I don't have a description in mind necessarily, but just an overwhelming confidence. In this case, in the other person. I mean, obviously, in a spouse, the same way, for fidelity and love and care. And in many ways, as we've talked on the last episode, that having a teammate in many ways is like a marriage. You're choosing someone to come alongside, and you're going to trust them, especially if you're going away or if you're sharing the duties of something very precious to you, which is the work of the Lord. And so, having that trust, this article really defines it well, and something probably that, as I've thought of teammates a lot over the years, is not one that I specifically had in my mind, but it is so true that really it's kind of the first thing when you are considering entering a team or receiving someone in a team or making a team, that you have to be able to trust the person's not only ability, but character, spirit, philosophy. And so this really was one that I guess I never had thought about as far as a definition, but how important it is to really trust this person with the thing that's after your family and your marriage, really one of the most important things in your life, because you've sacrificed everything to come and see this develop for the Lord's glory. And so you really do have to have trust. And I even thought about this. It's not necessarily specified in the article, but you're really trusting them. Often, as you mentioned, having close relationships with missionaries, you want to have some people you trust with your own family, your own kids. If you're a missionary, sometimes it goes off and preaches either far away in your own country or away. I remember leaving before and just having trust in my teammates that, if something ever happened to me or something happened to my family while I was gone, I had confidence they could handle the situation. So this was a terrific one to start off with. And I wholeheartedly agreed with the assessment of trust in the ministry. To have teammates, you better know who they are and have faith in them.
Definitely. They begin the article by saying trust occurs when one team member believes that another team member will do something that the first one believes is good and important, even when the first team member, cannot monitor or control the second. And so it's basically has to do with, part delegation responsibilities. And it's like you mentioned, when you're working as a team, you have to be able to trust the other team member that they are going to fulfill what they say they are going to fulfill. And that is something that doesn't come automatically. Trust, if you're on a team, you need to understand trust has to be earned. Trust has to be developed. Trust has to be cultivated. It's something that grows over time. And so there are general assumptions when you first join a team. You're going to assume that your teammate is going to fulfill certain responsibilities and roles. But I think that the level of expectation with the level of trust, those things are going to grow together over time as the one who is being trusted gains that confidence. And so one thing he writes is that this basically means each team member must know their own skills and their own gifts. Okay. When you're each on a team, you each have responsibilities. And when you delegate responsibilities that each one on a team has to each other, the trust that is needed for each team member is, I'm trusting that you're going to fulfill your part of this team and your responsibility because I'm depending on you getting this part done. When it comes to a team leader, the team leader needs to know how to evaluate different people's gifts on his team, to analyze where those will best fit in, and analyze at what level of maturity and development each of these team members have, and then to learn how to properly delegate. So if you're the leader of a team and a young family just comes in to join your team, and let's say they're gifted specifically in media, he can do filming and media and this and that. Well, sometimes there's two ways that leaders will go when it comes to delegation. When somebody comes in and if the leader's overwhelmed with certain responsibilities, especially if it's a task that he's not good at, and somebody younger comes in who's able to do it and knowledgeable about it, you're either going to throw the whole thing on them right away and say, hey, you can do this, take it and run with it. And in certain contexts, that's okay. But on the mission field, when a missionary first gets there, they're dealing with a whole lot of issues as they're transitioning and learning the culture and this and that a team leader needs to keep in mind. Rather, if he's the type who wants to just throw everything on right away, learn to delegate in stages as you analyze the growth and the capability of the new team member. And so he wrote this in the article: trust develops when there is demonstrated competence in a domain, and it grows when a missionary demonstrates concern for the welfare of other missionaries, when there is a clear commitment to group decisions, when there is increased communication, and when the missionary demonstrates a willingness to be influenced by other missionaries. Boy, each of those things are so important. When you were working with a team, how much of those did you see as being essential? Were you more, obviously they all are, but when you worked on a team early on, how did the collaboration work at first? Was there a lot of, hey, what's your idea? And what do you think about this? And how much were you soaking in from other missionaries? And then were you ever in a position where you kind of were in the leadership, and were you continuing to cultivate that?
Yeah, I think we're also going to talk about that more specifically down the road in the group discussion. But in this specific case, as far as trust goes, I was always, because we started the work and didn't have our first teammates for the first 3 years, and there were always gaps. It seems like, as we're going to talk about maybe later in a future episode, the idea of working and being by yourself, you get more and more accustomed to it. So, but as far as trust, it's so true that in the beginning, when you're receiving someone, first of all, it's a step of faith, by the way, the trust after you've taken assessment of a future teammate, and in our case, receive them. You're really stepping out among faith to trust them in any facet of the ministry. But it is true, the more you see people's abilities, especially ones that have abilities in areas that are your weaknesses, boy, it is so important that you can humble yourself and say, I think you do this better. But at the same time, just to trust them to make mistakes. There's nothing wrong. We make mistakes every single week. And so to hold someone to a standard where they can't ever make a mistake, and we're talking about simple mistakes. We're talking about mistakes like you may be forgetting someone on a bus route or not doing very good with, like you said, having the media prepared or not knowing a song real well. We're not talking about moral mistakes here. We're not talking about things that would, require you to take that leadership role or that responsibility. But it does require, just like what comes with nationals, it requires the missionary to say, maybe I can do this better. Maybe these people are actually ready to do it better than me. And I need to trust them because this idea of one person taking all the carga, all the burdens on them is going to be very ineffective ministry. And really, if you can't trust from the very beginning or learn how to have these baby steps to help trust, you're not going to develop a team where there seems like there's give and take. And so, yeah, in our case, we had to do that. I'm sure there are times where I could have done it a lot better. But I think the older I got and the more I saw people who had far better abilities in certain areas of life, especially in the ministry, than me, it was a joy to hand that over and a real pride to see, wow, this is really rolling along really well. And I'm glad they're here to do that.
Yeah, there's that constant theme of humility, humility and being able to analyze yourself in your limitations, in your own ability. And I think, what you mentioned, having started the church on your own, you probably came into that challenge of not only with if another American missionary came to work with you, but even with nationals, is knowing when to let go certain things, to delegate certain things that you're overseeing. That's a hard thing to do. One thing I wrote down as I was reading this article about specifically whether you're on a team member or a team leader is as you're being honest about your own abilities, so that you can not only let your team know, all right, this is what I'm able to do, and I'm willing to, plug in wherever you think I would best fit, but also being able to analyze where your weaknesses are so that you can find somebody else's strength that can plug in and offset your weakness. That's what makes teams so effective. And I think what will help cultivate a healthy atmosphere in a team is you develop this spirit of trust that cultivates unity when you die to self. All right. Absolutely essential. That's where we begin. And any of these principles, as a Christian, if we're going to work together in unity for the glory of God and implement every one of these principles, beginning with trust all the way to conflict resolution, down to goals, setting goals, all of that, it has to begin with what Jesus taught, which is dying to self. We are dead to self. And I like what I think it was Lee Robertson who would always teach this back in the day. He said, you die to criticism and you die to compliment. If you're a team leader, if you're a team member, if you just take care of that right away. Dying to criticism means that you are not going to allow bitterness or some sort of a misunderstanding create relationship issues on a team. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. Those things can be avoided if we die to what we view as bad criticism, when another team member may just trying to give constructive criticism. Maybe they don't have tact, the way we would like them to have tact. When you take it personally, the issues can arise out of that. And so if you're dead to criticism and then you die to compliment, and I think whether you're a missionary or pastor or whatever it is that you do, if you're good at something, if there's something that you are, by a worldly standard, you're successful at, people will begin to compliment and say, hey, what a great job you're doing. You're so wonderful and this and that. And unless you die to compliment, then you're going to allow pride and ego to to get in there. The way Nebuchadnezzar did, he walks out there and he looks at his big city. He looks around at all his power. He says, look what I did. Look what I created. And the Christian, whether you're in a leadership position or on a team and you're working as kind of the second role or as a partnership, you have to recognize that we are gifted by God's grace. And every gift that God has given us is only empowered by the Spirit for the ministry. In other words, there are a lot of secular people that are not saved, that are gifted, and they use those gifts for whatever area. There's great musicians and there's great artists and all of that don't use it for the glory of God. But when it comes to ministry, you take those same gifts, and unless it's empowered by the Spirit, it will be ineffective in ministry. You'll create a fleshly result. And the scriptures say, not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. And so we must, as a team, if it's going to be a healthy team where there is a spirit of trust cultivated, every team member must be dead to self, not allowing compliment or criticism to get in there and kind of destroy the team. Well, let me ask you a question. As a pastor of a church in a foreign country, do you get a lot of people who attend your church that seem to always compliment you? Or are Dominicans, if they see something that they think should be corrected, will they come and criticize you? Do you deal with compliment or criticism sometimes the way that maybe a pastor does in the States, where he gets kind of both all the time?
Well, generally, our people are very complimentary. They have these gregarious spirits. Now, Dominicans also have no problem telling complete strangers as well what their opinion is. And so
okay.
I'm thankful that I don't know if it's been one of those things that maybe by example, we from the pulpit and teaching don't do a lot of criticizing, so people understand if you're going to criticize something, you should probably do it in private. But no, from time to time, we certainly get people's ears full and they say, whether it be about specifically how we're handling a situation or the church, people are very confident to be able to express their critiques. At the same time, I would say generally they're very complimentary. But I think one of the keys is we've always tried, as far as the congregation is concerned, is try not to be one where it's, if I got a problem with person X, that I'm not telling person Y about it, And so I always do try to, bring it to me. And, but I'm thankful that I'm not someone who particularly loves critique any more than anybody. In fact, it's funny we're talking about this. I listen to our podcast often 6-7 days later just to try to critique it. And sometimes I'm like, oh my goodness, what was I talking about? And so, this kind of self-examination is very good. 100% agree with the idea of not believing lots of your compliments. I will say a lot of times we are lauded. And if you've been a pastor or missionary for a number of years, and sometimes people will laud you who really don't even know you, and you realize they're being kind or that's their personality. But the ones that count the most, the ones who are the closest to you and special to you and who have maybe in the past critiqued you. And so if they come to you with a compliment, you are maybe even more thankful that this person who once had a problem is now on the same page with you. But it is something that you have to have that balance and not take them so seriously either way. That's a good point.
Yeah, you look at Jesus coming into Jerusalem and they're throwing down their coats and their jackets and praising him and saying, Son of David, Messiah, complimenting him. A few days later, the tables turn and it's everything's changed. And so, yeah, you really do on a team. You have to, and we're going to get to this in a minute about relationship conflict, is once emotions. Yeah.
Real quick, I wasn't thinking so much in the team concept too, Josh, is that it's really important if you're the head missionary in this sense, if you're the lead missionary, to always try to lift the other teammate up in front of the people. Mm-hmm. Always try to laud what they're doing, because just naturally, if you're the lead, Others are going to be in the background. And if you want people to feel part of the team, you need to bring them up with you on a big day. Thanks for this pastor helping out and his wife. Look at what a great job he's doing in XY ministry. And so that is very important, I think, as far as trust is saying, hey, we see each other as equals here.
Yeah, as a team leader, you develop trust, because you have to develop trust just as much as somebody in your team, who's partnered with you, must develop and cultivate their trust in whatever responsibilities you've given them. But part of the way you cultivate trust is not, like you said, lifting them up and bringing recognition, even though we know that's not our primary motivation for what we do, is to be recognized by somebody higher up. But it's part of our human nature. It's part of the way God designed us, and to be recognized. And the Bible says that part of why the world became so corrupted early on was because they were not thankful, right? And so showing thankfulness to God sometimes is expressed in us showing gratitude toward those who are serving God and using their gifts and surrendering their gifts to the Lord. And so, yeah, I agree. Now, would you say that somebody coming to you, whether it was a teammate or somebody in the church, but we'll keep it in the context of a team, is somebody coming to you and questioning a decision you made, would you say that's a challenge to your authority, or is that something that could be problematic, or should it just be, hey, I made the decision, that's final, let's move on? Because one thing he writes, I'll let you think about that in a minute, he says, cultivating trust will create a healthy atmosphere where team members can feel safe to share weaknesses and vulnerabilities without feeling like they will be shamed or degraded. And so we're going to get to, again, in task conflict, this is the next point element. It's going to touch on this, so we'll transition there, where they talk about you've got to be able to question and bring your ideas to the table. But as a team leader, right, there's that balance you have to strike. So if somebody is asking you a question on a direction you're going or a decision you're making, what should the leader's response to that be?
Yeah, that was, it's funny that I hadn't thought about this in many years. It was very early on in our ministry with some of our first teammates. And there was a situation in the church where we had found someone had fallen into sin, two people in the church actually, and one that had, a relatively a new position of authority. And I'd never dealt with that kind of conflict before. It was new to us. I think it took a lot of time to ask other missionaries and pastors for advice how to handle it. And I really included this missionary who was very, very temporary with us, wasn't going to stay long. And I really wanted their advice and help and what we should do. And I thought we came to a consensus what we were going to do. And they said, this is right. This is what the Bible says. And it was very difficult that the day we actually dealt with this in the church, we were a small church. This missionary didn't show up, basically gave up some reason they weren't going to be there. And then they stuck with us. And then the next year basically kind of cut our feet out and with this other family and said, oh, they handled that wrong. And that really damaged our relationship for a while. And it really hurt to the core because I wasn't going straight ahead with what I thought was right. I really tried to take a consensus with biblical minds, including our own teammates who were very close to this family. And it really was something that hurt. And so in that sense, it did feel like an attack in many ways. And I praise the Lord. Maybe later on, we'll talk about how we heal some of these wounds. But that was one that sometimes when you're a leader, people say they're on board with you and then they change their minds. And you really sometimes can feel quite lonely at the top, but the Lord helps you through. And this doesn't have to be just with teammates. It happened to be in the case of teammates. It can happen just regular church members. But, that's where you need to have good communication. And even when you do, sometimes it doesn't work out the way you hope.
Yeah. And I think that this is actually the next point they make in the article, and it's kind of under this heading of the blind side of trust. And he actually mentions that when trust is too high, then there's some effects that can cause. Let me read it, because from what you just said, it sounded like you had a high level of trust on the input and the involvement of this other teammate. And then when push came to shove, they didn't show up, right? And so here's what he writes about that. He says, trust is only beneficial when it is accompanied with motivation to accomplish the team's goals. For example, a missionary team may have a specific goal of starting new churches or a broader goal of reaching a people group for Christ. However, if all or perhaps just some of the team members are perfectly content to run programs in existing churches, high levels of trust among team members will not help the team accomplish its purpose, right? In such situations, a high level of trust might actually hinder team effectiveness, since team members may mistakenly believe that good relationships among team members indicate that the team is accomplishing its purpose, right? And so the point he's making is, you may have a high level of trust and you may get along with this other missionary and everything's all peachy and everything's great, but that high level of trust is not allowing you, it's not causing you to ask the pertinent questions that need to be asked, that sometimes you can't foresee until you've experienced it, right? So with you, it was something that you had this high level of trust, it sounds like, but then when it came to pass, they actually weren't on the same page. And you know, that was most likely something they were failing to communicate. Obviously, they didn't communicate to you their displeasure with the way it was being handled. But all that being said, and we'll get to a minute, how do you handle task conflict? But that being said is, you know, that was kind of a similar situation where we're at, where the missionary we were working with, he was content, I think, to maintain the work that he was already involved in when we arrived. And then we had a vision and a heart to expand and to reach out into other parts of town and to implement some methods in different areas. And I think for us, we communicated that and we sat down and discussed it as much as we could. And I think where some of the conflict may have rose, if there was any, was that the expectation was that, well, that's great that you have a vision and everything, but we're just not going to do it. So we had to get to a point where we said, all right, well, I think the Lord is leading us this direction. And so we can still be friends and we could still partner in areas that we have agreement and method on, because we have the same doctrine, same theology and all of that. And because we made that separation, I was very deliberate, because we were still in the same city. I was very deliberate and intentional in making sure that I didn't take any members with me when we made that separation. I was trying to work together so that the church would understand, hey, we're not, this isn't a separate thing we're doing. We're a team here branching out and just extending the work. But because there was we were asked just not to attend the church anymore if we were going to go and do this thing. And we said, all right, well, that's fine. But I was also very intentional to make sure that I didn't want to create more conflict by causing more problems where I didn't need to be caused. We're here to pioneer a work. I don't need church members that we may have been attached to, but it wasn't our church that we came into and started or anything. And so, yeah, we moved on to the next area. And so that, in that case, yeah, I see what he's saying. You can have a high level of trust, but if you're not asking the right questions and you're not on the same page when it comes to your methods and your purposes, then, you can have all that trust, but it's just at the end of the day, are you getting anything done? That's really important. And that brings us up to the second one, which is task conflict. Do you remember when was maybe the first time on the mission field when you had a conflict with another missionary? You don't have to give any details, but it was just like, wait a second, we're not seeing eye to eye here. What's going on?
Yeah, I think it was early on, maybe in our first go at it, where, this is later on in the episode. At the end, I kind of want to go through a little checklist that I made that I've learned over the years that I'm trying to keep in mind is about being a good missionary. And I think maybe it was a communication breakdown, or obviously it seems like so now, or just obstinance by the other person, but where I felt like we had a real clear understanding of what their role was going to be in the ministry on Sunday morning during the week. And, you come Sunday and they're like, they're out of town. And you're like, what? And so, and not only out of town, but like with a family from the church, and one where we're trying to lead the husband to the Lord. And it's just like, you're on Facebook and seeing photos and you're like, well, this ain't good. This is not working the way I was hoping. I got to find out where the disconnect is here. And, I, as the leader, always feel like the leader takes on the lion's share of the responsibility. He often gets the lion's share of the credit. And so I've always felt like the two things when you're a leader, especially in a team, that you need to just get settled in your mind is, one, if there's a problem, you're responsible to get it fixed one way or the other. However that's going to be. It doesn't mean you necessarily caused the problem, but you are responsible to try to help fix that problem. And if it's a lack of communication, you got to work harder at it. And the second is you can't be bitter. And that's something we're going to talk about later on, that I praise the Lord that I think maybe through other people's examples, some cases poor examples, and I saw how their lives were damaged by bitterness. And I'm not even talking about missionaries here. I'm just talking about life in general, that I have strived in my life to not hold on to things. I'm sure there are things I need to work on or have in the past, but I really, when people do me wrong, I try to follow the example of people who have been before me, to try to forgive those people right away, try to resolve those things. And I'm thankful for that, because there were times where it was really hard to let some things go. A lot of time we feel like in our conflicts, it's mano y mano. It's a problem that he has with me, or my wife has with his wife, or XYZ. And so many times, missionary, it has nothing to do with you. There's so much going on underneath the surface. And that's what I've learned with age, is that when there are conflicts right away, I try to take a step back and say, what's going on with this person's life right now? There may be a whole lot that I'm not aware of, and I'm just getting the manifestation of this right now. And by the way, if that's the case, you should never take on bitterness for that, because you're not the cause or the root of the problem, but you're just happen to be in the front of it. So I do remember some of those conflicts, and we can talk about how you have to handle them, but they're not fun.
Well, man, you're so right. I never thought we'd be talking about this on our podcast, but what you just said made me think of the whole few weeks back when that actor Will Smith slapped the comedian at the Oscars there, and it made big news and everything. But it's one of those things where, what you said, like, there was a lot going on under the surface that a lot of people didn't realize between him and his wife. And like, things came out later. I was looking at Twitter feed and just reading about it, and he was taking out. And that's what so often somebody who is under a lot of stress, especially if they're an authority figure that is being undermined by people close to him. So if you're a husband and you're an authority figure in your mission team, you're a pastor, but you're being undermined by your wife, you're being disrespected by your kids, or whatever is taking place, you've got something boiling under the surface. A lot of times, men especially will take out that frustration on those who are either subordinate to them or those who are weaker than them and more vulnerable than them. And unfortunately, that's how a lot of abuse victims are attacked and abused, is because somebody who's trying to deal with their own stress and their own frustration and their own bitterness takes it out on somebody else. And so in a missionary team, like you said, so much you have to be able to step back and say, what's going on under the surface? There's been people I've worked with where it was evident that there were relationship issues with his immediate family, and it was carrying over in the team when we would come up with task conflict, and we're going to talk about define what task conflict is. But when it would arise in our team meetings or working together, where that frustration would be taken out either on myself or on my wife, because we were in the subordinate position. We were the new missionaries. But Julie and I would take a step back, in whatever the situation or whoever it was, whether it was with the national or whatever it was, and say, hey, there's probably something else under the surface here that we don't see going on, and we need to firstly pray, and then let's figure out how can we bear their burden, how can we figure out to resolve this, which brings us to this. So when you're working alone, so many of your decisions you make, you might try to run it by somebody else who as a veteran missionary or somebody who works nearby. But at the end of the day, you only have yourself and the Lord to answer to for different methods you want to implement and decisions and goals that you want to attain. An entirely new dynamic comes into place when you're either working in a team or you're leading a team. And one of the things you don't get when you're working by yourself is this element called task conflict. And he defines it this way. He said, task conflict is necessary for a good team. And he said it can be contrasted with relationship conflict. Okay, he'll define what that is. So he says task conflict occurs when two different ideas are presented as solutions to a problem. All right. That can be a good thing. And that's actually something I miss out on by not having a team right now. A lot of things that we want to implement as a church, of course, I run it by Pastor Malik. He's the lead pastor. And boy, I'll tell you, this is where, before we make a major decision, by having more than one perspective of how we're going to solve a problem, we can actually come up with a better solution when you've got two different perspectives. And so as a team leader, you need to understand when you present a solution and then another solution is presented, it isn't a challenge to your authority or your decision making, but it's an opportunity for you to say, man, I didn't see it that way. How can we synchronize those two ideas to create this super idea, this much better idea that we can implement and be that much more effective so that we can do the work there? Would you say, how do you deal with task conflict? Because you're making decisions all the time in the way you do everything. And I mean, everything from when you're going to take a furlough to who's going to preach for you and what ministries are you going to do and this and that. So every decision you make, do you run it by somebody to try to get another perspective? Or how does that work for you right now, seeing how you are as a missionary working alone, even though you have nationals with you, but you're working alone? What's that look like for you?
So in many cases that is something where, especially when you are the lone wolf, as is the case out right now with us, that we do make a lot of those decisions. For instance, right now in our case, there's some decisions being made for different kind of service adjustments in our absence for about 7 weeks that I have pulled aside the leading men in church. And I've, said, I'm thinking about this, but I'm very interested in what you think about it. Now, I appreciated what he was talking about in the respect of this article about the idea of maybe you're a team concept. And if you're kind of the head guy, instead of telling people right away what you feel is the right direction to go, have people kind of come up with an idea with pros and cons. I really love that. And so Josh is going to leave a link in this, the show notes, I'm sure, where you can go read this article. I encourage anybody who's involved or wants to be involved with team missions to read this article. It's a great resource. In our current case, very seldom are there big decisions that have to be made. And it is true that now in life, I probably tend to go to mentors in the faith and other missionaries first. But we do have the 3 pastors in town that will sit around and we talk about things. I do ask them questions. I feel like we have a good enough relationship where, they have their independent church, they're independent. And so they can come to me without me saying, well, that's a dumb idea, because there's no skin in the game. I do remember, though, with missionaries, very specific time, a very good friend of mine, Tim, who was our second missionary. And I remember I was getting ready to go on furlough. And as the lead missionary, it was the first time he was going to take over. I kind of had set an order of service where I felt like, you're going to preach these weeks. I'm going to have some other missionaries come in and kind of encourage the people. And he really took a hard stand on some things that I wanted to do, that he said, if you're going to leave me in charge, I'd rather not do these things. I'd rather do this X, Y, Z. And it wasn't a conflict. He really did it respectfully. And, it took me a little bit of time, but I sat there and the Lord really worked in my heart. He said, this guy has he's given up everything. His family's come here to live, and he really, really is behind you. You're trusting him. Trust him. And I said, you know what? You're right. These are ideas, these are suggestions, but I do trust you. You've been here for X amount of time. And there was a really good moment for us as teammates to say, hey, he really feels strongly about this. I trust him. Let's go that direction, and Unfortunately for us, it was during that time when his little daughter got a brain tumor, had to go home. But I really remember that encounter. We talked about it over the years and how he really stood up and said, no, I appreciate, like, if you were here, I'd be behind you. But since you're leaving me in charge. And I thought, wow, that was a really good, he felt confident to come to me and say that. We worked it out. There certainly wasn't any conflict in the sense of like bitterness. But yeah, so sometimes you have to be, especially if you're the second missionary, willing to stand up for your conviction and talk to the missionary. If you're the lead missionary, be willing to listen to those you've entrusted. And I'm thinking specifically of this family. They saw us, and we did groups like you guys do groups. And boy, I'm so thankful. There were time after time, little tiny things sometimes that Tim and Sharon would come up with ideas like, not to criticize you guys, but you're having this big group. Why don't you all think about, catering with this company, or why don't you consider using this resource? And man, it was just like, well, duh, that's a great idea. Thanks for bringing it up. I'm this old guy. I don't know. We need help. So that task conflict is not necessarily always a bad thing. It's just how you handle it.
You're absolutely right. And that's what he brings up in the article, is that task conflict is healthy for a functioning team. That if you're going to be that much better, the reason why you work with other people is not just to lead them so they serve you and do and fulfill your vision, but you work with other people so that their gifts and their skills and their abilities and their insight that God has gifted them with. And you got to keep that in mind if you're the team leader. God has gifted them. God has called them. I mean, you teach it and preach it to your church that every member has an important aspect, and God plugs in the members to the body so that the body is a fully mature, functioning organism that can glorify God the way that God has intended the church in unity to glorify him. And a missionary team is the same. We're not a church as a missionary team, but as a team serving the church and serving the local church, we have to be a model of that. And within a team, what makes a church healthy and what makes a team healthy is being able to confront and have that conflict where there is a differing perspective, or maybe one missionary sees something, like you said, that, man, you could be more effective if you implement this, or maybe, man, I don't know if that's the right decision you should be taking there. I mean, look at scriptures, look at the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter, right? There's no way I try to put myself in those shoes. If I was living back in those days, man, would I ever stand up to Peter and say, man, Peter, you're doing it wrong? I don't think I'd do that, and think about a church leader that you look up to and respect. Would you feel you were able, if you saw that, hey, what this decision you're making isn't a great decision, would you feel that there's openness enough that you can go and confront without it turning personal? And that's the key, because I think we're kind of coming toward an end here for, like, we don't want to go too long on this one. So I think we're going to go another week, because I want to get to some of the points you wrote down, and then we'll keep looking at this. But I want to point that out is, on a mission team, or you're working in a team of any kind, you need to allow there to be a healthy task conflict where everybody's giving their input on how they're going to resolve a problem that's arisen. And then the team leader needs to know how to take all of the data, all of the insight, and then plug it in so that it can be implemented. And maybe the original idea you came up with as a solution is now better because you had the insight of those who you are working with, but you can't make it personal. He says this is in contrast, task conflict is in contrast to relationship conflict, which is caused by personal attacks on people's character and on people's ability. And that's where you can either you take it personally when somebody says, well, I don't know if that's a good idea. Well, don't sit there and be like, oh, they don't like me. They don't think I'm able to do it. Don't take it personally. And at the same time, don't make it personal when you point out somebody's vulnerability or maybe an area where they're not making the best decision. And so the tension is maintaining a healthy task conflict without making it personal, right? And I think part of the problem that arises maybe in missionary teams is that those that God calls to go pioneer the gospel places, once you get a few years down the road, and especially if you're on your own, you do get set in your ways of doing it. Like, this is how it ought to be done, and this is how we're going to do it. I remember speaking with one missionary and I said, hey, why don't we go ahead and try this method here with implementing this? And it was something as simple as changing something that was analog and making it digital. We weren't changing anything. We were just digitalizing something that was analog. And he said, well, that's just the way we've always done it. And that was that. That was end of story. And okay, well, I'm not going to push it anymore because it's not like an essential for evangelism. But I thought, well, I mean, it's not healthy to be closed off that way. You're missing out on potential of what could be done for effectiveness for the Lord. But at the same time, as well, you don't want to develop what he calls groupthink from the article, which is where everybody just kind of says, yeah, whatever you say, that's great. Yeah, no, let's do it. Where the idea is you want to just please the leader. Now, I don't think in mission teams you get a lot of that. People end up going to the mission field. They're not there to just be a people pleaser, right? They're there to please the Lord. And a lot of times missionaries are strong, opinionated. So have you seen that contrast working with nationals where they just want to do whatever the pastor says versus working with missionaries where it's like, hey, we got strong opinions? How do you balance the two? I'm going to let you kind of close out with your thoughts on that and then close out with some of your the principles you wrote down. But how do you balance going from one extreme end of working with nationals who just want to please the American missionary and just say yes to everything? Generally, if somebody's mature, they'll give you the proper pushback that's healthy. And then on the other hand, you go home and you're working with the missionaries, and man, everybody's opinionated and everybody's got their own way they think it should be done. How do you balance those two things?
Well, that is something that you almost could have a whole podcast on as well, because, I'm sure like you and many missionaries listening today, future missionaries maybe, I try to be a real thinker and planner about doing something. I don't try to, Holly and I aren't people that necessarily just wake up one day, we're going to try this. So we try to think critically, how's this going to work? How's this going to work in the future? What are some of the possible pros and cons? Like he's talking about in the article, we do that as a team, my wife and I, before we ever bring that to the position of a leader, we're going to present it. So in the area of nationals, for instance, a lot of times I've already thought through 50 steps. And so in some ways, because we are still training these nationals along the way, it isn't necessarily, in my opinion, the way to go is to always kind of come up with the fresh ideas. It's rather to take, I think these are 3 or 4 really good ideas. And I've tried to think of the pitfalls. Let me go to my friends who have a much better perspective in some ways. But it's sometimes with nationals or people who are being led along in the leadership, it's not like, hey guys, what do you think we should do today? Because people who are still growing in the Lord are like, well, we should have a dance team or we should bring the drums in. And like, you know what? They're still coming along in their lives. And so sometimes it's not everybody gets to have an idea. It's like, hey, I got these 2 ideas. I think we're going to do it this way. What do you think about that? Are there some ways we could adjust? Dominicans, I'm telling you, I love them. They always can give you opinions and they usually will find something to help you think, so I don't have to ever worry about them actually coming up with some ideas and rubber stamp and everything, but I do handle new ideas with them differently. I've kind of already gone through a couple steps before I say, hey, all right, these are 2 or 3 ideas. What do you think of these? Instead of, hey, everyone's got an idea. Now go back to the missionary. When I had missionaries we were working together with, it was much more like, all right, how are we doing in evangelism? I don't know how great, what are some things you've seen in the past, some ideas? And so I think when you're in a team setting, it is different because oftentimes if you start something and you go off on furlough, well, you want to make sure this guy's behind you knows how to do it because he's going to be doing it when you're gone. And so I think there is a give and take back and forth between the groups you're working with, developing an idea. But even then, Josh, in the past, when I would have an idea that I felt very strongly about, it was very seldom on a whim. It was something that I had either prayed about, thought about, gone through 50 steps. And so when I brought it to our missionary friend, I was trying to say, hey, what do you think about this? But I really felt like I had gone down the road. And so when they would see errors and things like that, and I hadn't considered, I was real thankful. And probably over the years, it's probably probably because we're those pioneer missionaries, it's probably the area that was my greatest weakness, was not sitting down and including people to come up with fresh ideas. Now we did do it. It wasn't like it never happened. But looking back now, that's the pull. That's what your strength, maybe your independence. And yet when we're talking about a team, it will be the biggest hindrance and you have to work at it. And that's what this article is talking about.
That's right. Well, one of the things he ends on with task conflict is beware of cognitive overload, which is when there's a lot of information and a limited amount of time to examine the information. And that can happen on a team setting, and that can happen with a podcast where we just gave out a bunch of information here and we're almost at an hour. And so we want you to be able to process some of this information. So we're going to close it out today. And I think next week we'll continue this discussion, maybe do a deeper dive. We've still got the 3 other elements to look at: commitment to decisions, setting goals as a team, and then accountability. And I'd like to really dive into accountability because sometimes we have a hard time learning how to even define accountability. What does it mean? What does it look like? And so we're going to look at that and do a little bit deep dive into this article. I'll share a link in the show notes at the bottom. Go ahead and read the article, and I know it'll be a blessing to you. Is there anything you want to mention before we close out?
Just one last thing, and he doesn't really delve into this a lot, and so maybe this will flesh itself out a little bit in the practicality of our next one, but he talks a lot about the task conflict. And to be honest, Josh, even though we mentioned a few specific cases, because the missionaries we had come work with us, we pretty much shared the same vision. We had very little task conflict. It was very little. The conflict that usually arose was personal conflict, personality conflict. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that is something that you have to work really hard at. I really actually had a conversation, about a 2-hour conversation this week with one of our former guests talking about this team missions, my brother, Earl Lonnie Hammonds. And we were talking about how in teams, it's really important that someone in the team is a peacemaker, because you're going to have conflict, whether it be with the wives, the husbands, and because just, it's like having family. You have to know how to deal with it. And so maybe we can talk about that a little later on, but you really have to build that relationship up. And once again, one of the areas I wish I had done a little bit better, we made it somewhat of a priority, is spend time not in the ministry with your teammates. Build that relationship up. Learn how to communicate under less stressful times so that when conflict comes up, you have their back, they have your back, your friends. You may be closer than friends, like family without the same last name. And that's something I really want to encourage people who are considering team missions, is understand that personality conflicts will arise, and you have to learn how to deal with them, much like in marriage, and expect it, and just learn to develop those relationships. And when problems happen, deal with them immediately. Don't let them fester. And I think the Lord will help you along the path with your team and teammate.
Yeah, that's something we're going to want to look at later and talk about that relationship conflicts that arise, because that can be really essentially, if that's not dealt with, it can be a deal breaker for staying on the field. And so let's delve in a little deeper next week about differentiating between healthy task conflict and relationship conflict, and how if you don't deal with one or the other that properly, then it can be a disaster, really. And so we'll look at that later. All right. Well, this has been I think a great conversation. I've enjoyed this article, and I'm gonna reread it, and I know Erik's gonna read it again. And next week we'll go a little bit deeper into it, talking about all these different points that they make. And really, I'll tell you, missionary, if you have an opportunity to work on a team, do everything you can to be the right kind of teammate that you need to be, whether you're a leader. And remember, if you're a leader of a team of other missionaries, you're not a CEO of a company, okay? You're the lead servant. That's all it means. You're the lead servant. And if you're a subordinate, air quotes, missionary on a team, just remember, you're a servant. I mean, that's what you're on the team for. You're there to serve Christ, and you're there to lift up and serve one another. And we'll get more deeper into some of these issues next week as we continue our discussion on the all-important aspect of working as teams on the mission field. Well, this is Josh Mead from Senegal, West Africa. Thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you for listening. Please share with your friends and for future missionaries alike. And Lord bless and have a great weekend or week.